Hello, everyone. I am joined today by a guest who needs no introduction. We have Saskia Sassen, and we're going to be talking today about the new urban condition. And I wonder, you sent us this provocation of the new urban condition. How can we know that something has changed about the city? It looks to be the same as it always has.
Yeah.
What's happened?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because it's true, we tend to think that not much has changed. And so the question really becomes, how does change happen in complex systems, where it's difficult to track? It's not like demolishing a house and building a new one. And for me, that is an invitation for us to take what is happening in cities seriously. Cities have become sort of core zones for survival, for innovations, for a whole series of good and bad things. And so we must actually engage with cities in a way that I would say we didn't have to maybe 30 years ago, when it was the suburbs and everything was sort of easy and self-evident. Of course, it wasn't completely. But it seems to me we have entered a new epoch, yeah.
And so what are some of the dimensions of that change, that complexity?
Well, on the one hand, starting with the easier elements, the more visible elements, we have a new generation of people, young people, who don't particularly want cars, who want good green spaces, a lot of green spaces. And we elders, like me, we benefit from that because it is really wonderful to have all of that. Secondly, they want bike lanes, which is also an interesting dimension. Third, often not interested in cars. So in some cases you need a car, but if you can avoid owning a car, you avoid that because it means having to get to fix it, etc. So it is a set of small changes that actually amount to something that we can say, you know what, I think something has changed. It's not in your face, but it's that kind of sense.
So we have this kind of long legacy of all sorts of different people within the city who have different drivers, different passions. And these also kind of, the city is as well itself a place of tension, right? It's a place where these issues collide.
Right.
And I wonder if you can see that happening in the modern city.
Yeah, well, there are losers and there are winners. I mean, on the one hand, our economies in major cities, as they express themselves in major cities, and I'm talking about mostly economies of the West. In China, it might be a little bit different. In Japan, it might also be a little bit different. Japan and China being two very different kinds of cities. But I would say that in most of the West, the Americas and also Europe, the transformation has some very good things. Of course, there are problems. There are problems of inequality. There are problems of prices. If I can think of one real negative, something we've got to fight against, it is the emergence of very powerful firms that were in high finance, never interested in the city at all, who now suddenly are very interested in urban stuff. It's like gathering materialities and then transforming the outcomes. In other words, where before you had a set, a place, big zone, let's say, in a city that was housing for lower income people, now you will have a kind of almost like an extractive mode. Get the low income stuff out of this site and replace it with expensive and even very fancy buildings. Sort of a grabbing of urban land, inside a city. So in New York, we have seen the demolishing of several big buildings that had mostly low-income people in them, so towers, and replaced, you can't quite say high luxury buildings, but you know what? Very expensive buildings. And so that to me is problematic, that it's like an abuse of the logic of the city. The city should be a place where even those without power, those who are poor, can have voice, can experience themselves as I matter. This is also my city, that kind of, yeah.
I think it's really interesting that you use the word power in that, because that's really what we're talking about, I think, in terms of those who are able to use the city to extract what, usually capital for their ends, and where do the people end up in that conversation and in that story. And I wonder if you have seen any examples or have any fantasies about how the power might get back to people who live in cities, who create cities, where this complex emergent behavior comes from.
When you ask this question, I think of two vectors. One vector being the vector of expelling, right? Expelling lower income households from areas of a city where they before felt, this is also my city. The other one is fighting back. Now, fighting back, in the case of the United States, involves a rather brutal moment for many of these people. So you probably have seen in some newspaper story or something, how many people have lost their homes. People who are modest middle-class people, often very modest middle-class people, but often just modest middle-class people who have lost their homes, who wind up on streets. There are famous images of in cities like Los Angeles, New York, San Francisco, where you see people who are in their 50s and 60s. In other words, they're not drunkards. They are people who have had a job. They may still have a job, but what they cannot afford is housing. Now, we have in the United States, which is a fairly, if you want, unregulated country, is one kind way of putting it, because really... and so we have an expelling of people who used to own a house or have a house, and then the prices go up and they can't pay the mortgage. And we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of families who lose what they thought was theirs and they would have for good. How do we address that? I mean, this is pretty brutal. And at the same time, cities have become more important than they were maybe, 30 years ago, on the whole thing of how do you make a living, what are the major economic sectors, etc., etc. So you have a combination of elements that really works against what we might think of as the modest working classes and the modest middle classes, the modest ones. I mean, we have a middle class that really divides into two now, a very rich one, richer than they ever thought they would be, especially younger, people, and then one that is poorer. That's from mostly the older people. Those are sad stories to me.
I can really hear the personal impact that has, the kind of shattering impact that has on people's lives. Really, just a basic right to housing, quality of life, living. Like, this is not radical. But what also struck me as you were speaking is this expelling of people from cities. This kind of forceful eviction from public space, from private and public space of the city, and how the city itself loses when that happens. Yes. How the city itself becomes clinical and clean and empty in a way that this kind of the vibrancy and the gritty stuff of the city that we're all here for, and maybe that we're missing a bit in COVID times, how that is lost. Yet the financial or the power forces at play don't really mind that, because they're still got the safety of the capital investment.
Yes, and they can grab housing. I mean, it used to be that sort of towers for modest income people in big cities, not just in the United States, that it was a certain kind of local operator, not totally clean, but little crimes, not big crimes, huh? And now those same operations are in the hands. Sometimes I've been tracking one particular high-level financial firm. We have written about it, etc., but I don't need to give the name now. They're just acquiring. I mean, there is this one high-level finance. We're not talking housing. High-level finance firm who is now operating in 17 countries. And that includes Sweden, and that includes the Netherlands, and of course the United States, and buying up modest towers. I mean, towers, you know, made for modest housing families. And, you know, the next question is, what are they going to do with that? You know, are they going to keep renting it out or selling it? But these are new dimensions, you know, at that scale. It used to be that it was the local housing people, you know, handled it. Now, these are like top-level financial firms. I find that there's something not right in that, you know?
And do you think they have an interest in the well-being of residents?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, we can move on. I thought that might be a quick answer, but I think that's kind of the point, right? When you turn people's right to housing into a space for profit, we're going to run into some troubles. So let's talk about fighting back. I know that there are many activists who are really prominent and really talking about this work. I wonder, is government in a tricky position in this? And maybe you could, maybe have...
Well, you know, governments should be actors in some of this. Re-regulating the housing question is one shorthand we might use. But they are not necessarily the most powerful actors in this business. You see, that is the problem. And then the other thing that is happening, which is a bit more complicated, is that we now have instruments via algorithmic mathematics, etc. And just as a little footnote, you know, if you go into any of the big firms, like, you know, the firms that are doing a lot of this type of work, and very rich firms, I mean, they mostly are employing a certain type of intelligence that is not necessarily, you know, centered on finance per se, but that on the contrary, the whole purpose is that you bring in a different kind of intelligence in order to explore what are other ways in which you can transform element X that may be modest, etc., into something that really generates, you know, much more revenue. And we did a film that I really recommend to people. We called it Push as in push out. And there, Leilana Farhani, who is just wonderful, and she was in charge of the housing question at one point, you know, in the international system there. And so this film is quite illustrative, and it shows it all in a very simple way. And the film is just called Push. I think that is the name of it, and it's making the rounds. It gives you a sense. A good sense in a simple way. Anybody can understand it. So it leaves out some of the more complicated elements, but you know, that's okay. It just is just great filming, and you get it.
Amazing. And I wonder, is that a call to action for all of us, that film? Why did you want to make that film?
Well, it was just, I didn't make the film. I was just in it, you know, they interviewed me. No, this was two young people who decided to, well, not that young actually, but who decided to make this film because they had gotten interested in the housing question, and the housing question is everywhere. So in fact, Leilana Farhani, she went to 17 different countries, mostly the Americas, Africa, and a bit in Europe, in order to document this whole subject, you know, and I mean, look, when Marx and Engels walked to the mines, you know, in England, they were already talking about the housing question. It's just extraordinary, you know, and that term is just such a clean term, the housing question, you know, and they were talking about that. And here we are.
Yeah. And I'd like to keep focusing on this kind of new urban, and this new type of intelligence that you talk about that's transforming the way that some people are thinking about housing. what I often find is when you can change a type of intelligence into something quantifiable with numbers, and you can run it through a model which has all sorts of assumptions that you maybe don't know about and you can't challenge, those types of models become truth much more easily than a lot of the ways in which we describe social science and social interactions.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And that then serves for a kind of camouflage of the real question. And this is something that in this film Push also appears, you know, how there is a mode of describing the upgrading of buildings, so just that language of upgrading, right? That in a way camouflages the drama of expulsion, you know, because a lot of those people are not going back to those houses because it's just too expensive, because they have precisely raised it. And this one firm is just formidable in how they're doing it. I mean, it's really quite impressive. That is the one that we tracked.
And so we've got this huge dimension of the housing crisis, you know, right to housing. But we've also got a lot of other issues and the power of global firms in sweeping all of that up. But we've also, you know, in the 21st century, are facing quite a lot of other dimensions that add to this milieu, this complex system that is creating the cities that we're now living in. One that you referenced earlier, maybe not directly, was climate change and climate action. And I wonder if you can speak to how that story will interact within our own experience of security in the city, of well-being, of a sense of community, or a sense of safety in the city.
Well, I think in a way that becomes a gift of the gods, so to say, to have this issue with climate and with quality of air, right? Because when you marry that with the conditions in a city, you cannot forget about quality of air and all of that. And that holds for everybody, of course, ideally, who is in a city. So I do think that the marriage of these two conditions, you know, the housing question that re-emerged with all this, you know, with, I would say quite forcefully, and then this question of climate change, which is the other, I mean, that's a major event in our lives. I think that that's quite interesting, and really I think that a person like me, you know, I grew up at a time when I was a little girl, etc., where we're not thinking about all of these issues. But now these issues are at the heart of it. We could already have been thinking about those issues, but we realize how there is a kind of collective learning curve, you know, that a community or a country or whatever, you know, that it sort of suddenly changes. That, I think, is so important, and it's so important to valorize it, you know, to recognize it, and not to give up on people. When you have people who say young people who say, I'm not interested in that, you just don't give up. I'm a professor, I'm a teacher, so you don't give up. You say that, well, you keep on talking about it, and you say, and eventually they understand, oh my God, this is happening everywhere. And then they're interested, you know? So the new young generations for me are very important actors. I think they have entered a new phase, and they experience that in a way that we elders, you know, we have also entered that new phase, but we are still, you know, in some other zone.
But the question for me comes back to power again. So we have, very fair to say, a youth movement of climate justice and a really strong felt and well-articulated goals. They would say, I'm sure, that change isn't happening fast enough, and that there is a specific urban version of climate change which is particularly precarious, or that meets particular inequalities. Do you see any parallel processes between the housing crisis and the kind of big business power and climate action and the interests of people who have power?
Well, let's see. You give me these three elements in play. Let me just pull out one, and that is this question of climate change and air quality, you know, a whole bunch of things that come with it, and how that gets handled in cities. And I would say that cities, in a way, have been in their own modest way, because most cities are stressed for money, etc., but they have been making a difference, and either via governmental moves or via private actors' moves. And that, I think, we want to recognize it, because that also means that those cities who are thinking, oh well, where the leaders say, oh well, we're not going to waste money on that, they're then put on alert. So to recognize even these minor interventions that a city can have, say, okay, we're going to really try to clean up that water, clean up that air, etc., that then begins to resonate. And then other cities that may have leaderships that say, oh, to hell with that, then they say, no, wait a minute, we also have to do that, because they don't want to lose standing, and they want to keep the big firms that are operating. I'm just thinking about major cities. And so that is in itself also an interesting chain of events. But besides that, I think that the sons and daughters of the rich, especially, are clamoring for better quality air. Can we do without cars? That is also, there is a bunch of elements that are coming together that signals that we might just do something now, something good for the environment. But at the same time, boy, have we destroyed a lot. I mean, we have destroyed so much, when you look at the statistics, it's just absolutely horrifying. And it's just not just us in cities, it's us in plantations, it's us in, all kinds of other domains. So, we're going to pay a price for that, and especially our children will pay a price for that, and, So it's a problematic scenario, but there is at least some movement, some recognition.
Yeah, I think we can certainly see that particularly at a city level, mayors, local authorities are really pushing for transformation in this area, because they know that to be resilient and to that they'll need to have a clear view on that. So I very much see that.
We don't want to be too romantic. We still have truly regressive types. I'm just thinking about Trump and Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro, the head in Latin America there, unbelievable. And that is also still on. And you stand back and you say, I mean, what are they reading or drinking or eating?
Yeah, I think that's something we probably can't comment on. But I wonder if we've seen in the US that cities have kind of hunkered down as Trump has said no to climate action and have reaffirmed their commitment. So I wonder if there's something about city leadership that is closer to the.
Yeah. I think especially also the younger people, but also older people. It's true. No, because the city, after all, look, air quality is an immediate issue, right? So if you don't have good standards for cars, etc., so there already are little prior histories that prepared your typical person in the city to being aware, to recognizing, my God, that car's emissions, that should not happen. So there is a kind of a little knowledge zone that keeps expanding a bit and produces little demands on the city leadership. But, little demands across several years, it accumulates. And so there is, but we have to do much more than that. This is very nice that all of this is happening, but at the same time, I think the most dramatic spaces right now are not the cities. It really is the rural areas, the mining companies. I mean, they are truly destroying land. The plantation modes that just destroy whole fields, after 5 or 6 years of using certain modalities and certain chemicals, all of that. I mean, that is really serious stuff. There we really have to, there's work to be done.
And how much do you think those kinds of modes of extraction in rural areas are, by definition, urban, in that they are there to fuel the furnace of the city?
Well, yeah, the furnace of the city, but also the workers in the city. And so there you enter a mode that if you have air that is too bad, the firms will also lose, because they will have to I mean, they'll deal with either with workers whose lungs are not working well, et cetera, or they die and then they have to get in new. So there is a bit of I would say just a bit, I don't want to romanticize it too much here, but there's a bit of confluence of elements that have to do with climate change, that have to do with air quality, and a lot of that, of course, happens in cities. Plantations, very different world, because they're the owners. They're not going to spend time in the plantation and smell the bad chemicals. So that is more remote. But the city's interesting in that sense, because the grandees are there and the poor are there. And so, it creates another vector that you would not really find in rural areas.
That's really interesting, and I'd like to just pick up on that city as the place of extremes in wealth, or to talk a bit about inequality, which we've been sort of touching on as we've gone through. Do you think there is given we're talking about the new urban condition, is there a new mode of inequality in the city that we're seeing?
Well, cities have, of course, always been marked by inequality, right? It's just because you need so many different types of workers, so many different types of housing, so et cetera, right? So inequality is built into the city. Now, you can then say, oh, that is bad, 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 bad. On the other hand, you could say, you know what? It's good that it's the city where inequality makes itself most present. Because at least we all can see that that's happening. And then when you bring in a third element, the new generations, who are far more sensitive to questions of inequality, etc., then the city becomes an arena that makes visible a lot of the negatives in a way that a beautifully managed plantation, which might be destroying, but it all looks beautiful and perfect and people don't go there, that is an invisible event that is involved in destructions, whereas in the city, we also have, but they become visible, most of them. And that, at the same time, you want to sort of say, hey, the city is also, it's telling us, it has voice. And I like that image. I like this notion that the city is that is not going to work here. Because somebody will react, will contest, will criticize, will say, no, not in my backyard, or whatever. It might be a very racist element too. But there's a kind, whereas, have you been on big plantations?
I haven't.
Nothing, silence. You have no voice on a plantation. I mean, the workers may have voice, but not really. Whereas in a city, you have voice. Might be very little voice, but still voice.
Is there a way, I think that's a really fascinating perspective, in that the visibility of inequality is a sign that it's not as bad as it might be. Do you think that there are ways in which the city reproduces or keeps poverty in its place?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, I don't know of any city where you don't have unequal incomes. That's one way. Second way, when you look at Dutch cities, when you look at French cities, at German cities today, you see far more social justice in play than you do in the United States, than you do in Latin America, all the countries in Latin America. So that is really problematic. I also find that China, in its big cities, has more equality, though it's marked by also inequality, than say we see in the United States. The United States is pretty brutal, and so is South America, and Africa also has elements of that. Whereas the continent Europe is just a bit better, and China has its own way. They have built so much housing, for the poor, that has taken care of some aspects of misery. That the housing, at least the housing, is there in a way that in many other countries we have growing people who don't have housing. I mean, they live in slums, as we used to say.
Great, thank you so much, Saskia. This has been an amazing conversation.
You asked all the questions I love answering. That was pretty good.
Thank you very much.